Hi, welcome back to another episode of Uncognitive Distortions. Today, we're going to be talking specifically about the history of the stigma of mental illness and how that stigma carries over into today. But first, let's define what mental illness is. Mental illnesses are disorders that affect your mood, thinking, and behavior. Many people have mental health concerns from time to time. A mental health concern becomes a mental illness when ongoing symptoms cause frequent stress and affect your ability to function. Many mental illnesses are caused by imbalances of the brain. Just like people with diabetes have trouble regulating their insulin levels naturally, people with mental illnesses have problems regulating the chemicals in their brains. Here are some examples of mental illness.
Anxiety,
social anxiety,
depression,
attention deficit disorder,
panic disorder,
bipolar disorder,
postpartum depression,
obsessive compulsive disorder,
phobias,
anorexia,
bulimia,
post-traumatic stress disorder,
acute stress disorder,
narcissism,
schizophrenia,
addiction and substance abuse disorders.
I could go on. There is literally a book listing all recognized mental illnesses, and it's not particularly small. Here's just a small touch of part of the cause of mental illnesses. This first file is schizophrenia, and it is full up to the top of dopamine. Too much of something can be just as bad as not enough. This next tube is anxiety, and it's extremely low on dopamine. The third tube is happiness, and it has a good level of serotonin in it, not too much or too little. This next set of tubes symbolize depression, and as you see, there is very little dopamine or serotonin. Now, we know a tiny bit about mental illness and one of its causes. Let's talk stigma. So, what is stigma? It's a generalizing disapproval or discrimination against a person or persons based on perceived social characteristics. Stigma is a Greek word that in its origins referred to a type of marking that was burned or cut into the skin of criminals, slaves, or traitors in order to visibly identify them as blemished or morally polluted persons. These individuals were to be avoided, particularly in public places. There is a stigma attached to mental illness and health. You're crazy if you have a mental illness. You're weak if you go to therapy. You're not reliable if you have a mental illness. Bullying, physical violence, or harassment for being different. The villains in media and film are often depicted as having mental illness. And then there's the stigma people with mental illness assign themselves. Shame, weakness, hopelessness, and isolation. So stigma is used to shun people who are considered less than. Stigma has been widely accepted and even encouraged in most civilizations throughout history. Many cultures have viewed mental illness as a form of religious punishment or demonic possession. In ancient Egyptian, Indian, Greek, and Roman writings, mental illness was categorized as a religious or a personal problem. During the Middle Ages, the mentally ill were believed to be possessed or in need of religion. Mental illness was considered a punishment by God. Sufferers of mental illness were burned at the stake, chained to walls, or chained to beds. During the Salem witch trials, many mentally ill women were called witches and persecuted. As far back as the Bronze Age, between 2200 and 2000 BCE, trepidation was used to treat mental illness. Trepidation is cutting a hole into someone's skull using an auger, bore, or saw. These negative attitudes towards mental illness persisted into the 18th century in the United States, leading to stigmatization of mental illness and unhygienic and often degrading confinement and treatment of mentally ill individuals. Now, how many people remember what eugenics means? It's this idea that through proper breeding and ridding people of undesirable traits, that one can complete the perfect human race. Discontented with being mere caretakers, psychiatrists began to work towards cures and preventative techniques in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The most conspicuous manifestation of these new techniques was the growth of eugenics and forced sterilization. These cures were targeted towards specific populations, such as immigrants, people of color, the poor, unmarried mothers, and the disabled. Negative eugenics aimed to eliminate, through sterilization or segregation, those deemed physically, mentally, or morally undesirable. This included abortions, sterilization, and other methods of family planning. Now, who remembers one of the biggest supporters of eugenics in history? Hitler. Some common early 20th century eugenics methods involved identifying and classifying individuals and their families, including the poor, promiscuous women, homosexuals, mentally ill, blind, deaf, developmentally disabled, and racial groups such as the Roma and the Jewish people as degenerate or unfit, and therefore led to segregation, institutionalism, sterilization, and even mass murder. The Nazi policy of identifying German citizens mentally or physically unfit and then systematically killing them with poison gas, referred to the Action T4 campaign, is understood by historians to have paved the way for the Holocaust. Individuals with severe mental illness are 3 times more likely to be in jail or prison than a mental health facility, meaning our jails and prisons have become America's major health facilities, a purpose for which they were never intended. In the 1960s, states took up an initiative to reduce and close their publicly operated mental health hospitals. However, the states did not receive sufficient federal funding for community programs to meet the growing demand. As a result, hundreds of thousands of mentally ill people were released into the communities that lacked the resources for their treatment. Consequently, many of the released individuals ended up incarcerated. So why is this still a problem today? Public opinion construes and precipitates stigma through mental health with devastating consequences. Stigma leads to discrimination. Bill Clinton once said, "Mental illness is nothing to be ashamed of, but the stigma and bias shame us all." Although we don't burn people at the stake or starve people with mental illness to death, our societal standards and attitudes are nonetheless unworthy of modern welfare states. Discrimination of the mentally ill is still pervasive, whether it be in legislation or rehabilitation efforts. For instance, mental health treatment isn't widely covered by all insurance carriers, invalidating people who face mental illness and leaving them on their own to try to seek treatment out of their own pockets. And that's even if they can find quality mental health care in their area and can be seen, avoiding year-long wait lists. The most prominent stereotypes surrounding the mentally ill presume dangerousness, unpredictability, and unreliability. Many people who struggle with mental illness also internalize societal stigmas that they've grown up with. They blame themselves for their mental illness. Many consider themselves weak or feel guilty or ashamed about their condition. Their self-esteem is impacted and can lead to behavioral presentations like embarrassment, isolation, and anger. People with a mental illness are less likely to seek treatment for fear of being labeled and considered shameful, dramatic, and crazy. People with mental illness are less likely to maintain treatment for their illnesses in comparison to a physical illness. Part of this is shame, the availability of adequately trained healthcare professionals, and the cost of treatment. Internalized stigma rears its ugly head with reduced hope, lower self-esteem, increased psychiatric symptoms, difficulties with social relationships, reduced likelihood of staying with treatment, social isolation, self-blame, viewing oneself as weak, and deeply rooted shame. Here are some examples of stigmatizing societal quotes. It could be worse. Just deal with it. Snap out of it. Everyone feels that way sometimes. We've all been there. You're just looking for attention. You may have brought this upon yourself, and just stop being sad. So, stop calling someone schizo because of their actions. Stop calling someone OCD for organizing, cleaning, or having a certain preference. Don't refer to someone as bipolar for having a mood swing. Stop referring to a situation as triggering unless you're specifically referring to someone with a mental illness. And stop with all these: crazy, nuts, delusional, mental, loony, maniac, wacko, insane, manic, split personality, deranged, and psycho. Those are all very hurtful for people with mental illness and perpetuate the stigma. Mental disorders are not adjectives. How to stop the stigma? We talk openly about mental health, such as sharing on social media. Educate yourself and others and respond to misconceptions or negative comments by sharing facts or experiences. Be conscious of language. Remind people that words matter. Encourage equality between physical and mental illness. Draw comparisons between the treatment of physical illness and mental illness. Show compassion. Normalize mental health treatment, just like other healthcare treatments. Call out people when they are using stigmatizing language or presenting stories of mental illness in a stigmatizing way. Take a mental health education class. NAMI offers them all over the country. Link in the description. For the good of 25% of the world's population, we have to stop the stigma. I need you to remember, you are not alone. There is hope for recovery. Labels are for jars, not people. Mental health is health. And if you're considering harming yourself, I beg you to reach out for help. It could save more than one life, and this world is dark enough, and we need your light. Please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing.